Okay, good morning. Dear colleagues and friends, so happy to see you all here in Turku and also here on site at WAM. My name is Mika Väyrynen, and on behalf of the Turku Museum Centre, I have the pleasure to welcome all to our seminar day. Today we are focusing on the queer perspectives on the future museums. The day is divided in two parts. In the morning, we are going to hear shorter speeches about new Finnish museum projects and the planning processes, and about documentation about LGBTQIT materials. And after that, we are happy to hear our keynote speaker, Pia Laskar, on the topic, the unexhibited sexuality. And this first session is streamed and it ends at 12:30. After the lunch break, we continue with workshops with those who are here on site at the museum. And about the safe space, please notice that WAM is free of any kind of discrimination and harassment, and we all stand for equality and respect for others. The seminar is organized by Turku Museum Centre, the Culture for All Service, and the Friends of Queer History Association. And I would like to invite Riitta Pakvaleen, who is Director of the Culture for All Services, to tell us how everything gets started, please.
Thank you, Mika, and welcome also on behalf of both Culture for All service that I'm working with, but also Friends of Queer History, the organization. I'm a board member of that organization, and this year we are not celebrating, but remembering that it's 50 years since homosexuality was erased from the criminal law, and 40 years since it ceased to be seen as a sickness, illness, and only 10 years since fetishism and transvestism was taken away from the list of diagnoses. So this is also a year where we remember all the history that has been both erased and silenced, and how museums can work with that kind of history. There is a noise in the cafeteria, so we'll have a small break here. And I'm very happy that we have this seminar today. In Finland, we've been working quite much. There are many museums that have been working for 15 years with thinking about how museums can take LGBTIQ history into account, how queer art can be exhibited, and how one can queer collections. And I'm very happy also that today we have Pia Laskar, who has been doing that kind of work in Sweden for a long, long time. She's a doctor of history of ideas and associate professor of gender studies. And in her doctoral dissertation, she studies sex guides from 1800s till 1910, and how heterosexuality was normalized within these guides, and how certain ideas of gender and sexuality was performed in them. But she's been a project leader for a project that is very interesting called Unstraight Research, that was in 2016 to 2018, and the project was launched by Unstraight Museum, which is a museum, an online museum that queers the history and queers the museum collections. And Pia will talk about that a bit later today, and she will talk also about the book that is very useful for museums called Den utställda sexualiteten, and that book can be downloaded in the internet. But so on behalf of both Culture for All, but especially also Friends of Queer History, I'm very happy to welcome you all to the seminar, and I hope we have a very interesting day and a lot of interesting discussions, and also to all of you who are online right now.
Thank you, Riitta. And now we move on in our program, and our first speaker is Project Director Kaarina Gould from the new Architecture and Design Museum. So please welcome Karina. Ja sitten tosta sä pääset. Mä katson vielä.
Good morning, everyone. Fantastic to be here in Turku, and fantastic to see real people in front of me after so many Zoom and Teams presentations. And good morning to all of you also watching online. Mika already told that I currently run a project that is leading towards founding a new Museum of Design and Architecture in Helsinki, a National Museum of Design and Architecture. I will share a few words about where the project is, what the status is at the moment, and then of course try and focus a little bit on today's theme of Queer Eye. To that theme, I come from a perspective of having worked and lived in New York for the past 5 years, where of course themes of representation, identity, and mandate have been very much at the forefront of cultural life in the past years, and no cultural institution in New York has been kind of able to navigate the landscape without really considering and taking those themes into consideration in their practices. I'm also a mother of a transgender child. I've raised a trans child, and my son has definitely opened my eyes into how to see the world from the perspective of someone whose gender identity doesn't match what they were given at birth. But a few words about where we are with the new Museum of Architecture and Design in Helsinki. I'm trying to press a button here, but the slides don't move. Are they moving? Oh, they're not moving here. Okay, so I can't see which slide I'm showing, but
okay. If you take this one. Mä en tiedä miten tää.
Maybe I'll just go that way.
You should take this instead of that.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Are you seeing kids playing with architecture? No? Okay.
To take this. Sorry. Voiko Sessi tulla katsomaan? Tämä ei nimittäin nyt liiku tämä esitys.
Well, I'll just keep speaking. And
Yes, you can speak.
if we sort it out. Yeah. So there's an ongoing project of founding a new museum for architecture and design in Finland, and it's been a project that's been sort of in the dreams of not just the architecture and design community, but both locally and of course globally. Knowing the legacy and the impact that the Finnish architecture and design scene has globally, but also an ongoing lobbying project by the two museums, existing museums, the Museum of Finnish Architecture and the Design Museum in Helsinki, both of which operate in buildings that were never meant to be museums and very much limit their abilities to present Finnish architecture and design in a way that would meet the expectations. There was a feasibility study done in 2018, and then a concept study done in 2019. And based on those studies, the Ministry of Education and Culture and the City of Helsinki have now launched this new project phase, which is aiming at a final decision to found and build a museum. And I'm running that project. So I'm not working. I mean, I'm working with the Museum of Design and Architecture, but not at either one of those museums, but in close collaboration with them, but with the mandate of the City of Helsinki and the Ministry of Education and Culture. And our aim is to get that final decision to build a museum in about a year, in early 2023. So my job is now to come up with a proposal and a project plan that then the City of Helsinki and the Ministry and a number of private founders, funders would then make the final decision. Now I'm trying to change the slide again. Did it change? Great. Thank you. There's a location already set for the new museum. It will be built, or it would be built if the decision is made in Helsinki's Etelä-Satama, the South Harbour area in Makasiiniranta. It's pretty much the same location where the Helsinki Guggenheim would have been built if that would have happened. I was very pro Helsinki Guggenheim. Now I'm super happy that it didn't happen, because this, of course, is a much better plan. And I'm also very happy that we're working on this museum right now, on this very day and age. All the plans and the feasibility studies were done prior to the pandemic, but of course the whole pandemic years and the social political movement and turmoil that's taken the globe has given us a perspective that we would have not had before the pandemic. We haven't said much about the profile of the new museum yet. We've talked about the financial structure and the administrative structure and where it will be and so on and so forth. But the profile of the new museum is something that we're going to be building in the next year before the final decision. But the one thing that we have said is that there's a commitment to base the museum on the profile, the concept, the operations. The building of the new constructions is to be based on both social and cultural responsibility and also environmental responsibility. And those are, of course, words that cannot be taken lightly in this day and age. There's an ongoing competition at the moment. So the difference between the previous museum plan for this site is that the City of Helsinki has decided to redevelop the whole area around the museum, so that the museum would have surroundings that are sort of meet its value. And so instead of a parking lot, there will be a new redevelopment of that area. Are we now seeing a timeline? Okay. The timeline that we've set for this project now is, as I said, the decision to found and to build a new museum would be made in early 2023. And the project plan that I'm working on now will consist of not just the profile and the concept about the new museum, but also the design brief for the future building. And then after we get the decision, we would then launch an architectural competition for the museum building. So the ongoing competition that the City of Helsinki is now running for the Makasiiniranta area does not include the museum building. But that will be planned and designed separately. I think in your timeline you see a bigger goal, that is the opening of a new museum. We've now said that the earliest it could open is late 26, and that of course is a very ambitious plan. But it's good to have an ambitious target and an ambitious plan to keep the machines rolling. but most likely we will update that timeline when we get the final go and start making more concrete plans about the construction. The plan is to merge two museums, the Museum of Architecture and Museum of Design in Helsinki. And the merger of those two museums would then happen about a year after the final decision to found the new museum, so in early 24. The two museums are already getting ready and preparing for the merger, and then most likely a year or two before the new museum would be open, they would then move out of their existing buildings and moving to a museum of no walls phase where they will operate in some temporary location, doing pop-ups and focusing on the opening of the new museum. Now I have to navigate a little bit. So the two museums, we're not just founding a new museum, but we're also merging two museums. And these are two museums with very established institutions. The Design Museum was founded already in 1870s, and the Museum of Architecture in 1950s, in times when everything considered queer would have also been considered illegal. So their collections and their practices when they opened were based on a very different kind of world perspective than we are seeing right now. But I quite admire how these two institutions have been rethinking their practices and their policies and kind of adjusting and taking a careful look at how they operate and navigate the world around them, which I think is the only way to survive for an institution. The Museum of Architecture and Design, they've actually published, within the last year, they've done a thorough work in creating guidelines for a safer space, not just for the public, but also for the team of the museum, and that is to be found on their website, mfa.fi. If you want to take a look, and there's also a way to leave comments and feedback anonymously for those guidelines, if you wish to do so. Both museums within the past few months have taken a series of trainings on safer space. The last one being conducted by SETA on focusing on diversity, on gender and sexual orientation in museum practices. And currently at the Design Museum, there's an exhibition called Intiimin kosketus, Intimacy is the English title of the film, which focuses on contemporary Finnish fashion, very much focusing on designers and practitioners whose practice is based on gender fluidity. So the next year for us, we're sort of at the very beginning of writing the proposal for the new museum, but we'll also have these two museums and their legacies, and we have the concept study done for the new museum. But as I said, that was done prior to the pandemic, and so much has happened in the world. So we really need to take a careful and close look at what the world is around us at the moment, and kind of rewrite and rethink what a relevant museum institution is in this day and age, and especially how do we create a museum institution that stays relevant for decades to come, to build something that is meant to be there for not just 50 or maybe 100 years. We need to build an institution and a building that is adaptable to the society around it. And the key question really is what we ask at the moment is who the museum is for. And of course we want it to be for everyone and for all. And with that question in mind, the questions of representation, mandate, identity, and creating a safer space for not just visitors but also the team is key when we write this proposal. if you think about design and architecture, they've really been the building blocks of the Finnish welfare society. They were the industries and the disciplines that sort of unified the nation after the wars and after the depression. And now we're facing a totally different kind of society with different kind of challenges, and we really need to think what the role of design and architecture can be in facing these challenges and building a new kind of welfare society that is inclusive and diverse and open to all. And of course, the question that we're here thinking, and I'm sure all the speakers after me will also ponder on, is what the role of museums is in this question. We've been sort of playing with words and ideas on what the identity of the new Museum of Design and Architecture is, and one of the key words that comes is activist, and I think the work that we're going to be doing in the next year or so really focuses on, can a museum be an activist, and what kind of an activist a museum can be. How do we build a workplace that is safe and inclusive? How do we build an institution that is sensitive and porous to the signals of the society and the community? And how do we build an institution that is organically diverse, where mandate is built from within? And with that question, we come to big structural issues also in our society: who can be educated, who can climb the steps in the working world and the profession. Are we now seeing a side of a website front page? No? Is this what you've been seeing all along? Oh, okay. Interesting. I think it stopped. Okay. Okay. I think I'm running out of time, and I'm. Well, I just wanted to say and show we've just opened a new website for the new museum project. The address is admuseo.fi. And that's a site where you can follow the project, where we're going and where it's heading. And there's also a newsletter you can subscribe. It's in Finnish and English. The website is also in Swedish. And I would very much like you to reach out, challenge us, give us feedback on how we're progressing on the themes that we are talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. So super interesting to hear your work with your new museum project. I'm sorry for the technical problems, but there's always some technical problems. But I'm sure Ceci will solve everything with that. Okay, but now we move on in our program, and our next speaker is Joanna Kurth, the project manager, and she will tell us about the Museum of History and the Future. So please, Joanna, welcome.
Sorry about the delay. Have to get the presentation. Onko tässä joku niksi, millä tämä vaihdetaan? Okay, thank you. And please do some marks or just wave your hands or something if the slides don't change. So I'm Joanna Kurth, and I'm very pleased to be here thank you for inviting me to tell a little bit about Museum of History and the Future. And do you see the new slide? Okay. Marvelous. Perfect. We are going to open a new museum in Turku, in Linnanniemi, and it will be open in 2029. So it's kind of abstract to talk about a museum that's in the process of making and in the process of planning. And right now we are doing a museum concept and thinking about the content of the upcoming museum. But in a way, everything is very abstract at this point. And I would say that for the project in general, the co-creation and dialogue and doing things and planning as an iterative process have been crucial. So we have done a lot of expert and stakeholder interviews, and we have interviewed people who don't normally come to the museums, and we've taken all feedback and opinions that we have had and moved forward with the planning process based on those opinions and feedback that we've gotten. So this kind of a dialogue has been very important. And now when we are doing museum concept, okay, it seems that it reacts only for a short period of time. So when doing the museum concept, we have talked a lot about the trends and everything that's happening within museum field and about the future or what we think is going to happen and what are possible futures that are ahead of us. And based of all this thinking and talking, we have found 6 kind of a future trends or principles that are now bases and guidelines for doing the museum concept. And of course these are all connected, but in a way they are also telling about what's current within museum field and within discussions within museum field. Purpose for the new museum. The new Museum of History and the Future, in its heart, will be a city history museum. And we aim to be a little bit more ambitious of doing the content for the museum, and not just telling the stories within our own city, but thinking a little bit more widely, and also thinking about what kind of a future we are wanting to create and construct. And I would say that when the Turku is in as a heart of the content for the new museum, we want to also think about history and histories from the perspective of futures, and at the same time reverse the way we think about the future. So the real purpose for the museum is, of course, to build more equal and more sustainable society in general. Mission, the idea of changing lives, to have a very impactful content for the museum, I think is crucial thing. And about this multi-voiced museum, I would say that world and humans are diverse, and to have this diversity and multi-voicedness integrated in everything museum does is a very good, very beautiful aim. Of course, it needs a lot of work and a lot of rethinking about how we do our work. We know and are aware of structures of power and this kind of a learned manners of speaking, but in many ways we are also blind to those, and we have to challenge our doing and our way of thinking constantly in able to hear and give voice to minorities, that those who have been marginalized, and really tell their stories and rethink history and reinterpret history so that their voices and their stories can be heard and told. And in a way, museums have been doing good job with this kind of a thinking, and there are good processes going on. But as I said, it's a constant reflection of our own work, what we are doing. The mentality of don't talk about us without us means that we have to cooperate, we have to share expertise, we have to have a lot of participatory practices. And this, in a way, challenges the way we do museum work, because doing cooperation, doing this kind of work, it takes a lot of time. And because it takes a lot of time, it's so easy to put these things in the hold and do only projects and this kind of short-term projects with other expertise and minorities. But really have this kind of work integrated with everything we do means that we have to make really big changes in our operational models. And the other thing is, of course, the diversity of our staff. In many museums, staff really doesn't reflect the diversity of societies around the museums, and this is something we have to work on. So I would say it's a learning process for all museums. It's something that we have to do together as museum professionals, and of course together with all different groups, all different minorities and expertise working with these groups. And I would say that we are on a good way, in the beginning of a good way, and we just have to keep on learning and keep on talking with each other, with people outside museum field. So thank you. And sorry about all the technical problems. I think my thought processes were kind of interrupted, but I hope that you get something out of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. And then we move on. I try to do a change here. Our third speaker is Leena Ahonen, Collection Manager from the Finnish Labour Museum Werstas. And now we are moving on collections and documentation. Can you see the slide? No. Okay. What about now? No? This is interesting. Mitä? Okay. I think we take a small break now and we try to solve this problem, and we continue after 5 minutes or something if we have to change the machine. So let's have a break. Sorry.
Tää on niin juntturassa, että ei avaa mitään.
Niin, koska se on hassua. Se on totta.
Ja siis se on laitettu tohon sen takia, että se näyttää striimauksessa hyvältä.
Mutta meidän pitää kokeilla, että jos me saadaan se näkyviin sen. Joo, ottakaa tosiaan kahvia ja leipää ja tehkää vähän kyykkyhyppiä, täällä on vähän kylmä.
Se jotenkin meni välillä niin juntturaa, että se
Okay, let's continue. Please take your places.
So hello, my name is Leena Ahonen. I'm from Werstas, the Finnish Labour Museum Werstas from Tampere, and it's great to be here. And I don't know how many of you are from cultural history museums, but I speak only on behalf of cultural history museums today. And we are a national specialized museum for social history and working life. Here are some basic facts about our museum. We have about 60,000 objects and 360,000 photos. And you can see our collections online, for example, from www.arjenhistoria.fi and Finna, of course. And here are more about our themes in our museum that we have national responsibility. One of them is LGBT+. And these responsibilities are based on mutual agreement of a nationwide division of tasks in collecting and operated by TAKO network for cultural history museums. So we have working life, like working environment, unemployment, working methods, trade union movement, and in social history we collect labor movement, environmental movement, peace movement, and feminist collection we have, and then we collect anti-racist movement. And there's also two separate parts in our museum, the Finnish Museum of Deaf and Lenin Museum. And so we have a lot of responsibilities, but luckily we are not alone in this task. We cooperate closely with the Finnish Labour Archives. They collect institutional material, archive materials, also LGBT+ memories and oral history, and we both collect photographs. We have international partners, other labour museums that we follow closely. For example, the People's History Museum in UK. And university students and researchers are a big asset. And we happily loan our objects to other museums and share information. Now I've launched a new rainbow group within this TAKO network. And I hope we can have more discussions about LGBT+ themes and learn more about the existing, maybe queerish themes or queerish collections in Finnish museums. I'd like to see that us, the museum professionals, are a tool for the communities to preserve their own cultural history and for themselves. We are humble servants and we are here to help and also do the dirty work and assist. But the motivation and the will should come from the communities, and hopefully also the benefits will return to the communities and to the society as a whole. And we cannot collect without the communities or over them. We've collected LGBT history for 15 years more, and thanks to Tuula Juvonen wise proposal. And this has meant a shift from us, from quite organizational histories and public figures to more private and personal stories. And we have in our LGBTIQ plus about 1,500 objects and more than 1,000 pictures at the moment. So the collection is still quite small. Without active collecting, the collections will not be balanced. For example, now the intersex or transgender people are underrepresented in our collections. We want to posit objects with a deep meaning. Unfortunately, sometimes people are more prone to donate things they don't need than things that are meaningful. What we've learned the hard way during these years is that all donations need some kind of interviews. Donators have to tell their stories and share their views and use their words, because we can't start to guess or their identity or their meanings to the objects or photos. But what slightly concerns me is that there's a great interest in interviewing LGBT people by the media, by researchers, by museums as well. So I fear that if sometimes they can feel a little bit fatigued for all this interest, because of course not everybody has to be interested about history. There's a current debate whether museums should be more outspoken. We in Werstas have always recognized ourselves as political actor, not in party politics, but as an active member in civic society. We're trying not to be vaguely neutral or cautiously unbiased. We want to make the world a better place, and we want to have an impact to the society and want actively support human rights. So we focus on changes in the history and the ways the changes are made. It's not always easy to get the message heard. Since we have many themes of marginalized people, it's interesting to examine their intersecting patterns. We need more collecting on those junctions like feminism and LGBT, people of color in queer communities, gender and sexual minorities in working life, and for example, queer deaf people or other linguistic minorities. We are collecting cultural history from communities that are alive today, not only past generations and long-gone traditions. Human rights violations are still happening today, and people who witnessed those are still alive today. It makes this collection work especially valuable, but also challenging. As a museum, our focus is in the past, and many times it's in the future. We try to preserve the objects from the history to the future, but we're not always ready or able to serve our communities in this day and age. Because of photographic copyright legislation and special terms in acquisitions, a big part of our collections are accessible only in the future. The photos can't be used, stories can't be told today. Digital collection tools are oftentimes too expensive, and we have to settle a lot less than we would like to. Collection management is a slow and long-term process. Dialoguing is time-consuming, and when we try to speed things up, the first we skip is deeper research, unfortunately. At the times of climate catastrophe and uncertainties in the future, our whole idea as a museum storaging for the future will start to look, if not unwise, but maybe even a wasted time. If, like, power grids become unstable or limited in the future, all our cataloging work will become inaccessible. Social media and the speed society runs today puts a lot of pressure to museums to act more dynamic too. Sometimes we really should react more rapidly, document events that as they happen, and interview people while they're still alive. And we should be able to serve the communities with their fight for social justice. But oftentimes, slow speed is also our asset. It allows us to evaluate how to modify our collections and focus on the important. I think and hope that queer aspects will spread to all museums and to all exhibition policies in Finland. Social inclusion and social justice is something you can't just dump for only some museums to deal with. But in terms of collecting, I hope we get support from other cultural history museums to build up our LGBT+ collection. I hope we don't end up competing and overlapping with the documenting work. This is why I call for stronger cooperation and dialogue with other museums. I hope our collections in Werstas will have the support and donations needed to become even internationally recognized Finnish LGBT+ collection to serve best its members. Thank you.
Thank you, Leena, for your important speech. Now I think we have time for quick questions or comments if you have. We have microphone there on the audience, I think. So if you want to ask about something, but our speakers are here in place now. Then we will have a short break before Pia Laskar comes on stage. Oliko meillä se mikki jossain? Okay. Tuula will ask something. Yes?
Thank you. My name is Tuula Juvonen, and I have a question for the two first speakers. How are you and with whom are you collaborating in order to ensure that the new museums that you are planning also have what Leena Ahonen was calling a queer thread through the exhibitions or collections that you plan to create?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. The project that I'm running currently focuses on the institution and the building, and of course the institution and the building are what give the platform for presenting the exhibitions and public programs and activities and how to present the collections. But what we are trying to ensure that we have adequate curatorial expertise in years to come to present programs that meet the expectations of the time. But that is part of the planning work that we are doing now. But like I said, I'm quite impressed and quite proud of the two existing museums, which will then merge into the new museum with their extensive nationally significant collections, how they are now rethinking how to present their collections and how to kind of rewrite the narrative around their collections, which have been collected and put together over more than a decade already. Thank you.
Thank you for a very, very good question about the Museum of History and the Future. It is, of course, a new museum, but it is part of the Turku City Museums, which we already have 6, and Turku City collections are quite vast, quite large, I would say. So it is a question about how and what kind of work we do with city collections, how we diversify these collections. And then for the new museum, we in first phases, we invited different groups and stakeholders to comment upon the viability study. For example, Culture for All was invited to comment, and we did a lot of rewriting based on those comments. And the next round of commenting will be in the beginning of next year, when the museum concept will be more ready and more ready for commenting. And after that, we are doing the disposition for the main exhibition for the new museum, and the co-creating phase for that will be open a year from now. So we will be doing the exhibition disposition as a work group, which is also consisting of people outside our museum, but the actual work to diversify the content of the main exhibition comes through this co-creating phase, which will last for 1 year. So for the new museum, we are not going to collect a separate collection. It will be part of the Turku City collection. And now we are mainly focusing on doing the best type of museum concept and then the best type of main exhibition disposition for the museum. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions here?
Just a quick question. Can you maybe say something about the Taco Rainbow group? Because what you are doing within I'm very happy that Taco now has a rainbow group as well.
Well, yeah, it's online. We have this special Taco room where we can share documents and discussions. But that I just launched it, so it's let's see. Hopefully, it will become more active than so. But yeah, it's meant for museum professionals, and I think now only for like cultural history museums are involved. But that's also almost 200 museums, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a short break now, and we will continue 11:07. Thank you.
Okay. Shall we start? Because we are already a little bit delayed because of all these technical problems in the morning. I hope it seems like they have fixed it now. Can you hear me well, like this? It's a vague echo down there, but if I talk within this distance? Okay, Terve. I would like to thank the organizers first for inviting me here. Åbo Museum Central and föreningen Regnbågs historiska vänner and Kultur för alla. I said that in Swedish because I'm from Sweden. Unfortunately, I can't speak Finnish, even though my mother came from Karelia a long time ago, and she spoke Karelia, so She never thought us that because she thought it was a language that died out. So unfortunately, I can't speak Karelian or Finnish. Anyway, it's nice to be here and give this lecture in real life, even though it's a pandemic. And during this lecture, you will also be divided into groups, so it's good that you have your shields on, and you will sit and talk 2 and 2 for a moment, or perhaps 3 and 3. Yeah. Okay, I'm just moving on because the time runs. I am an historian of ideas and a gender scholar, and I have for several decades researched and thought on notions on sexuality and sexual ideals and gender ideals, but also the history of theories on race. As you can see on the slide, I've been writing about the Finnish race and the doing of Swedishness in a book called Ras och vithet. Unfortunately, you can't download that, but you can download my book, Den outställda sexualiteten. Unfortunately, that book is just in Swedish, but it's right now worked on, it's a translator trying to translate it into English. So eventually it will be published, hopefully in English as well. But you can search for the title on the web and you will be able to download it for free. Yeah, well, and that book is a result of a research project that I conducted at the National Historical Museums in Sweden. It was the point of departure for that project was that LGBTQ representations in museums, when they were conducted, were not were just exceptions to what was daily going on at the museums, it was just temporary exhibitions and maybe exhibitions or guided tours that was going on special occasions, like if a Pride festival was going on in town, or some memorial day of an activist was appearing, then the museum could conduct some kind of activity with reference to that. And the aim of this project was to intervene into the permanent exhibitions. So the overall goal of this lecture will then, as the book and the project, is to share some knowledge from that research I did during these 3 years in the National Historical Museums, to intervene into the permanent exhibitions and to the museum work in general to be more inclusive. And not just inclusive when it came to all the discriminated categories related to the Swedish discriminatory law, but especially when it came to marginalized groups, related to gender and sexuality. So,
The content of this keynote is, as says on the PowerPoint, I will problematize first the concept LGBTQ, and I will discuss different usages of the term queer, and then I will move on to some notions on how sexuality and gender has undergone change over time, and discuss a little bit about uses of history related to LGBT and some pitfalls that comes with that. And finally, discuss 4 models of inclusion. And I hope the time will let me do all these things. Yeah, firstly, the pride of calling oneself an LGBTQ person today is very much about dealing with derogatory terms and internalized homophobia and transphobia that stem from various marginalization processes in the past. However, we must remember that LGBTQ abbreviations stands for several mutually quite different categories with different objectives. Their relationship with each other as categories has also changed in recent decades. As with many other categories, the difference within one and the same group are greater than the differences between the categories within the group. Different gender, socioeconomic conditions, skin colors, ages, citizenship status, some are newcomers within these groups, and not the least different ideological affiliations. So conflicts of interests and the problematic of bundling people together in an imaginary LGBTQ community results in that one letter, L or G or B or T or Q, is not being able to represent everyone else in the larger groups. In the larger group, there are too many differences within the LGBTQ spectra. And that is something to think about when you're building focus groups in your projects. And within the LGBTQ spectrum, there are also voices who wonder whether we, for emancipatory purposes, can use terms that have arisen for oppressive purposes. Remember that homosexuality and transsexual, etc., was once used as a medical diagnosis with related therapies. So many minority groups today struggle against being portrayed stereotypically. Stereotyping was a part of the 19th and the 20th century's way of classifying race, class, gender, and sexuality. Parts of these categories or categorizations have become obsolete, but others are slipping into the 21st century. I mean, we are not trying to explain class in biological terms anymore, but still we are trying to explain gender in biological terms. Now then, should museums avoid re-inscribing the LGBTQ spectrum as a unified identity group? Museums' tasks is not to work with identity politics, but what we can do instead is to give perspectives on the emergence of LGBTQ identities and other identities. We can tell the story of how these identities has developed in what contexts. And one way to do this for the museum is to focus on the normative processes that have contributed to creating designations such as LGBTQ, on those who do not fit into gender and sexuality ideals of the past and of today. I will return to that, but first I will problematize another term, namely queer. And I'm so happy that the PowerPoint works, because I can just see what I will be saying in the PowerPoint. I usually explain queer as that there are three meanings of queer. You can use queer as a noun. You can talk about the queer person or a queer movement, organization, and so on. And it can be used as an umbrella term for LGBT plus people. And then you have queer as an adjective. Someone or something is queer or unstraight, or for a while you said pervo in Finland, but I heard yesterday that you are not using pervo anymore so much anyway. But that is in the meaning of that something is not fitting into the norm. It's queer. It's, yeah. And then the last meaning is queer as a verb. And queer as a verb wants to disrupt or displace heteronormativity. And in that queer as a verb genre, you can also fit queer theory. Queer theory is a critical perspective that examines relations between the center and the periphery, between what is considered as an ideal or norm and what is considered as deviant. So it's, of course, a part of the post-structuralist tree, you could say. You can use also critical perspectives on notions of all kinds of ideals or norms and on what deviates from those. But the critical perspective that queer theory stands for is focused on gender norms and sexual norms. And hence, queer theory examines heteronormativity and gender normativity. And I belong to that school. So when I arrived at the National Historical Museums, and especially the Historical Archaeological Museum in Stockholm, I thought I would land there as an UFAO, but I didn't. Because several museums today, as we have heard in this by these previous speakers today, several museums have a critical perspective, but not all of them examine the normative processes that in the past have contributed to creating gender and sexuality ideals of today. So I thought I was going to land as a UFAO when I should start to work with this deconstructive processes in the museum, but not. The first thing I learned was that there were no Vikings during the Viking Age. And I became, what? What have I missed? You know, because in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, it's such a big thing that we are descendants of the Vikings. And I always wonder why there were no Vikings in Estonia or in Finland. It's the same sort of area. But then the head of the research unit at the Historical Archaeological Museum explained for me that during the Iron Age, nobody called themselves Vikings. Vikings was a label for people during the Viking as a label for the people during the Viking Age, during the Iron Age, were added during the 19th century at the special stage in Swedish history where Sweden had just parted from Finland, or as the 19th century Swedes saw it, when Sweden had lost its eastern half to Russia. So, you know, Finnish history is a part of the creation of Vikings in Sweden. The national self-esteem was wounded because of this loss. And a way to heal it was to invent or colonialize a glorious and magnificent Swedish past with a heroic masculinity embodied in what they call the Vikings. And the head of the research unit, he had actually been writing his thesis on this, called colonializing the past, Viking Age as a colonialization of the past. So I thought that was very, very interesting. So along with the nationalist story of a Viking Age, those who did not fit into that narrative, such as other peoples than trading or plundering seamen, other economies than trading or robbing overseas, other religions and ways of life were excluded from the narrative of the Iron Age in the North, as were women, children, and slaves. And this kind of deconstructive analysis allowed me to say that there were no heterosexuals during the Iron Age. The concept heterosexuality arose in the 19th century in a special context, and at the same time other sexual expressions were excluded as deviant. And the researchers at the museum were like, yeah, because they were already familiar with that way of critically studying different idealized uses of history. So I could move on with my project. Of course, not everybody was enthusiastic at the museum. People, and you know that, people are protecting their reveres, their areas in the museum, and they might not want to change anything, whereas others are just going on. Well, but I was lifting up that view of what sexuality is and what sex or gender is has changed over time. And also how we interpret these things have changed over time. When we study the past, we can see that in different periods have defined gender marks in a very fluid and changing way. From antiquity, for instance, until about the 17th and 1800th century, it was considered that males, respectively females, were on one and the same biological scale. But on that scale, the female body was considered less developed than the male due to that the female's energies was seen as something that was used to give birth to children and to boil the children into a child somehow in the body. But the female vagina, as you can see on the slide, you might think that you see a penis, but it's a vagina. It's different kinds of vaginas that you can see there. It was by medical doctors of the time considered that the vagina was a penis that could fall out if the women lived an active life. And the scholars speculated whether this could happen if someone with a vagina, for example, jumped over a river. Then her vagina could fall out and become a penis, a visible penis. We can laugh to this today, but they were seriously thinking so. But socially, on the other hand, the gendered division was very rigid. The medical historian Thomas Lacour, he believes that, or have shown more, that when social rigidity was challenged by democratization processes and women, for instance, gained greater influence, biological gender differences were instead carved into stone. And that was the same with class. When the lower classes were demanding rights in the end of the 1800s, they were biologized. Yeah, well, they were explained in biological terms. Class were explained in biological terms, as were, as you know, skin color and different phenotypes, and even the Finnish race was also explained in biological terms, or the Finnish tribes, as it was called. Anyway, when due to democratization process, this sameness on the same scale was sort of collapsing, and the biological differences were carved into stone. Whereas, yeah. And also our contemporary idea that sexuality is the core of a person's personality, and that such a sexual core is identity constructing, is quite young. In Europe, it's about only 200 years old. So it is, of course, indisputable that bodies are saturated with different kind of bodily sensations, but how these sensations are interpreted and what they are connected to and how they are valued and conceptualized is culturally determined and varies from place to place and also in the same place over time. So during the Middle Ages, bodily sensation that we today call passion could be described as a person being enchanted, and that the origin of the enchantment was a witch or a wizard. Also, a medieval discourse discussed love sickness, i.e. the notion that one could get sick from feelings of love, which today are so highly estimated or seen as something weird and queer. So today we see all these emotional storms, falling in love and bodily sensation as a part of a person's constitution or an inner character. Emotions that are considered sexual are also seen as strong expressions of the individual, often as something inherent in the individual and given by nature. But you can have a look at this picture and wonder who of those people are intimate in a bodily way or a sexual way. Yeah. Humans have always been sexually intimate with one another or themselves, but how we have understood this relationship and actions and the role that they played in society have changed through time and space. For example, research have shown that the term sexuality wasn't incorporated into European languages to signify intimate, pleasurable action separate from procreation until the second part of the 19th century. No one, prior to this, sexual actions, sexual subjectivities, or sexual identities weren't categorized in the same way as today. No one referred to themselves as hetero, homo, bi, or trans. The terminology didn't exist. Instead, there was a divide between the desirable and the undesirable, and the line was drawn between procreation and sterile actions. So the practice of, for instance, oral or anal sex was undesirable, be it heterosexual or homosexual. And being LGBTQ, pervo, or heterosexual are thus quite young identities. Rather than mediating a contemporary understanding of sexual identities, it's important for museums to dare to describe how contemporary understandings have been constructed. For example, museums could describe how religious violence, punishments, diagnoses, health declarations, pleasure ideologies, and other sexual politics have contributed to constructing heterosexuality as an ideal. And that was what my thesis was about. How has heterosexuality been idealized, in what ways, when it comes to medical and health issues, religious issues, family politics, or whatever. That is something that the museum could describe, actually. There exists research about processes of idealization and related marginalizations. But when museums want to open up for a wider variety of perspectives, they often, as we also heard this morning, consult experiences of living people belonging to various previously marginalized groups rather than collaborate with ongoing historical research. At the same time, speaking of implementing gender perspectives in museums, has been commented by the historian and director of the Royal Armoury Museum in Sweden, Malin Grundberg, who has described how lived experiences doesn't necessarily change norms. In a female-dominated workplace, such as museums, men are still the norm. To have women produce an exhibition doesn't necessarily change the male norm. Nor does the perspective of self-identified LGBTQ people's perspective on their self-perceived oppression automatically lead onto that heterosexuality as an ideal and norm are questioned in an exhibition. Based on this conclusion, we can also suppose that the addition of Sami people, Jewish people, Romani people, second and third generation labor migrants or refugees to museum collections and exhibitions doesn't automatically change visitors' perceptions about what a typical Finn is or what the Finnish identity entails. The late 19th and early 20th century notion on the ideal Finn as a blonde and blue-eyed person may nonetheless remain. Yeah, the only couple here that we know for sure had a sexual relation, or we don't know if it was sexual, but they lived together and wrote love letters to each other, is those ladies to the right. And the rest is photos of people doing what people can do in their space and time. Okay. I will move on to uses of history in the LGBT movement. And in the 1970s, a lesbian feminist group in Stockholm published a photo of the Swedish 17th century king Kristina kissing her bedfellow Ebba Sparre, but in a Hollywood movie. And they just froze that moment when the lips were meeting and made a poster of it. Kristina was acted by Greta Garbo, and both King Kristina and Greta Garbo were then linked to rumors of having been lesbians. The point made by the lesbian feminists of the 70s was that both Kristina and Garbo had been placed in a historical closet, but now was the time to let them out. And this is an example how a use of history, it's an example of uses of history in which a particular group at a certain time sought to legitimize their own political struggle in that very contemporary time for change through telling a certain story about the past. That's a way of using the history to make a political point. And these days, the trans movement and the trans rights activists are the ones to showcase King Kristina and their use of history, now depicting Kristina as a trans person, which is made by Alexa Lundberg, as you can see in that photo, in a theater play that was shown a couple of years ago, written by the famous Elisabeth Olsson, the photographer of Ecce Homo. Okay, and now Kristina is used as a trans person to make a political point of today. And the strategy of adding individual experiences needs to be discussed and developed. We must also make use of a greater variety of strategies rather than exclusively focus on the experiences of marginalized or excluded individuals to create more inclusive museums. However, the experience of marginalized individuals are important in order to shine a light on certain matters and create long-term behavioral and policy changes. And to realize what questions are at stake right now for marginalized people, we need to discuss with marginalized groups and peoples. But if we do so, when we do so, it does not examine or on another level how sexuality and gender are constantly filled with new and different meanings that have suited the present. It does not tell us how these LGBT identities arose as something deviant. No questions are asked about who and what have benefit from the creation of these categories, and that heterosexuality became the sexual expression that was idealized and became the norm, and with it two binary sexes. By working with researchers and scholars and by focusing on how processes of normalization or museums' uses of history throughout history have excluded, rejected, and renounced certain categories to benefit others, we need further perspectives on objects, identities, and stories. Yeah. I think you should do a little beehive exercise now instead of just listening to me. So I would like you to sit 2 and 2 or 3 and 3. As you sit, just turn to each other and start to study your colleagues' dresses or details. What kind of hair color do they have? Glasses? What color of the mouth shield or shoes or whatever. And then you should just say, I see you're wearing a black shoes and a gray socks today. And then continue to say that I think it's totally fine, and I think all the other people in the room thinks it's totally fine. And the one who is then approached by this shall just say thank you after hearing this detail, and do so and change persons in around, and do that for some time. Go on. Go on. No, you. Go on. Okay. Okay. Did you all have the time to say thank you to someone who notified something on you? Very good. How did you feel about it? Nice. Strange. In what? Maybe for the people out there viewing this, streaming this, maybe you should have a microphone. Could you just say why it felt strange? No. Put it on.
Is it on now? Yes. So I said that it felt strange. And it's maybe the fact that there's something on you and someone sees it and decides to say that it's okay that you have this. So it's kind of a permission thing that wasn't asked. I didn't ask about permission or being accepted or something like that.
Yeah, some more reflections?
Yes, so I said that it felt quite awkward to be commented in that way because I didn't choose my outfit today so that anyone could comment on it. I just came here and I'm not asking to be accepted in any way. I'm present in this situation, so yeah. And I think this was a quite good exercise. Thank you.
Yeah, we can have another last reflection, perhaps. Some felt nice.
Do you want to say?
Yeah, I've been living in New York for the past 5 years, and there it's common that you step into an elevator with a stranger, and within those 30 seconds, they point out something you knew that they appreciate, and they say it out loud, and it's a very normal thing, and it's very cultural, and it doesn't happen here. So I think this session felt really nice from that perspective.
Okay, and when they sort of leave the elevator, they say that they love you as well. Anyway, yeah, the reaction from you two is very common, and it points to our museum's way of tolerating people, and like we have nothing against Muslims in this museum. On the other hand, we really appreciate when you are here, and what should they say? Okay, thank you. Or it can be Sami people, transsexual people, or LGBT people of any sort, you know. I think that it's something to think about when we sort of try to be generous and inviting people and approaching marginalized groups, that they are not, they shouldn't be thankful. Yeah, but I think it's a good exercise too, because it gives you something personally. If you haven't been in New York for 5 years and doing it in the American way, but that might also be a tolerating thing that is on a certain level or of a person's multifaceted character. Anyway, we will go on because time runs, and I'm thinking of now proceeding with talk about 4 models for inclusion, which is something I learned from this research project. And it's built on an Asian American actually called Kevin Kumashiro, who was working as a teacher in an ordinary school somewhere in the United States, and and then he tried to teach marginalized people, and then he moved on to become a researcher in pedagogy, and he tried to cover what kind of pedagogics there existed that were turning to marginalized people, and he found 4 models, and I converted them into something that could be used by museums. So in the following, I will highlight these 4 models as tools to make museums more inclusive and encompassing of those which have previously been marginalized. Even though I will focus on public activities such as exhibitions, the models can also be used to reflect on all kinds of museum activities, collecting, conserving, preserving, and making things accessible. And the models can be described as such. What have happened here? You can see them on the slide. Exhibition for the marginalized, exhibitions about the marginalized, exhibition that take a critical approach to privilege and marginalization, and exhibitions that change museum activity and the visitor. And it's important to remember that there are no set or absolute boundaries between using any of these models in the daily activities. No, one, some, or all 4 of them may be used by the same museum at work with one and the same exhibition or in guiding of it. And the models can also be used by one and the same museum worker or by different staff members within the same museum unit. But in order to accomplish thoughtful work and exhibitions and museums, as well as conscious storytelling, it's, however, I think, important to reflect on the meaning and consequences of each specific model. So, Model 1. The starting point for this, and as you can see here, I will go through the objective of one model, methods that you can use, and some problems that come with that. And I will do that for each of these models now. The starting point for the first educational model, exhibition for the marginalized, is to increase knowledge and points of reference for people who have previously been marginalized and excluded by museums. By increasing knowledge and points of reference for previously marginalized groups, the idea behind Model 1 is to empower and to some extent restitute the previously excluded by sharing knowledge about their place, imprint, and contribution to history and society. To achieve this, Model 1 aims for the marginalized group to be able to consider itself a part of the society. As you were discussing when you talked about Veritas project earlier. Some methods to achieve goals in Model 1 are, for example, to unpack forgotten or hidden histories in collaboration with specific marginalized groups. Not seldom, we do this on special occasions, such as a gay pride festival, a local celebration of International Women's Day, or as I said before, the anniversary of an event, for example, the birth or death of a particular activist. Another commonly used method is to produce separate and temporary exhibitions that emphasize the marginalized or excluded, for example, trans people. Also common is to offer special interest-guided tours of permanent displays, often focused on oppression and resistance. And another common used method is to conduct themed discussions, seminars, or lectures, perhaps such as this. Yet another related method is to add stories about the marginalized group, for example, Sami people, to a corner of a permanent display or exhibition. All these methods may empower groups that have long been excluded from museum historiography. The methods should enable marginalized groups to visualize more of their history and participation in societies past and present. The advantage of exhibiting for the marginalized is that previously excluded people and their past can be acknowledged and emphasized. The failure to acknowledge and emphasize marginalized groups is in itself discriminatory and contributes to recreating stereotypes and obscuring social diversity. However, there are also problems with this model. The diversity of different and even contradictory interests within a group, as I mentioned before, means that it's problematic to assume that all members of a group have a common interest. As with other categorizations, the differences within any group may be greater than those between different groups. A person may be both queer, Jewish, Afro-Finnish, and wheelchair-bound. And being queer can be a lot. Now, you can be trans, you can be lesbian, you can be a gay man, you can be non-binary, you can be whatever. So that must be taken into consideration as well. Since any one individual has multiple belongings, experiences, and identities which variously intertwine intersectionally, the kind of marginalization that museums choose to confront must constantly be problematized. We may also ask which members of the marginalized group are in focus. If women are to be added to an exhibition, which women are intended, which perspectives disappear or develop based on these choices. If museums don't problematize the definition of who the marginalized is, exhibitions for the marginalized will always exclude others within the group. The reasoning behind Model 2 is that a lack of knowledge leads to people getting excluded or marginalized. To remedy this lack of knowledge, the purpose of this model is to mediate knowledge about the situation of the marginalized to all museum visitors, not just to the marginalized, and thus contribute to creating empathy and consideration for the marginalized group. And some methods to achieve goals in Model 2 are as follows. One method has been to place an entire exhibition about previously excluded groups centrally in the museum space, located in a spot where most, if not all, museum visitors must pass by, like this, right? An exhibition in Brighton, England, did just that. The museum decided to produce an exhibition about queer fashion from the 1960s through the 1990s. The exhibition aimed to showcase Brighton's rich variety of LGBTQ people and their styles. The exhibition was placed centrally in the museum in such a way that everyone had to pass by that space. And at the other side of the room, styles of clothing worn by Caribbean migrants of the same area were on display. All museum visitors thus had opportunity to explore and experience the fashion of these two groups and be made aware of their presence in the city's history. Creating an exhibition about the marginalized aims to challenge incomplete or partial knowledge about the marginalized group. And I will come back to the Caribbean and queer exhibition, but I will add another method first, and that is to integrate particular traces and narratives about, for example, activists, resistance and creativity of marginalized groups into regular guided tours, labels, and exhibitions. And you are aware of that method. But there are some problems with that model as well. And one pitfall is that exhibitions about the marginalized include that museums potentially can reproduce a stereotypical image of the past by adding the excluded to a pre-existing narrative that isn't simultaneously problematized. The exhibitions about queer fashion and the fashion of Caribbean immigrants that was centrally situated in the Brighton Museum is an example of incomplete knowledge and issues of representations. The exhibition did not ask the question if immigrants could be queer or if queer people could be immigrants. A queer immigrant focus group seems to have been missing, which pinpoints to one problem with adding underrepresented groups to a pre-existing narrative, namely that minorities are often described from a majority standpoint, lacking an intersectional perspective. So the result will be incomplete and partial. Even if the curators wanted to strengthen and support queer people and include Caribbean immigrants, the point of departure was a selective sample of queer representation based on mainstream society's representation, which ended up recreating and stabilizing both a normative queerness and a heteronormative Caribbeanness. Right? Yeah. Without disregarding the fact that empathy is important to bridge gaps between the privileged and the marginalized, the included and the excluded, Model 2 doesn't explain how differentiation of the marginalized has occurred. And with the methods of Model 1, exhibition for the marginalized, which are used to, as I just told you, to counteract exclusion and marginalization, the Model 2 isn't enough either. both of those two first models are not enough. So let's move on to number 3. And I can't quite see what the time is, but yeah, so I can slow down a little bit. Okay. So model 1 and 2 are not quite enough. Museums also have to showcase and narrate how some groups and identities have been privileged and normalized. Museums cannot just point out what has been excluded, but why did this exclusion happen in the first place, or continually. So, model 3. A third model used by educators who want to counteract exclusion is to shift the focus from the towards the privileged from the marginalized, and to the relationship between marginalized and privileged people. So model 3, to create exhibitions that take a critical approach to privilege and marginalization, demands acquiring more knowledge about the processes that have led to the exclusion and marginalization of specific groups. By illustrating how the marginalized and the privileged relate to each other and how these relations are structurally, discursively, and socially maintained, people may come to realize how distorted the situation is and therefore want to change it. And some methods to achieve goals in Model 3 are as following. Yeah, I could first say that the method is about a relearning process, or several relearning processes, and it takes a lot of time. Firstly, as part of these relearning processes, we have to reflect on what processes of privileging and marginalization are about. And we can do so by questioning that which has previously been considered normal or taken for granted. Secondly, we have to investigate what and who had benefited from it. Thirdly, the result of the relearning process should have an impact on all aspects of museum work. Instead of adding queer people or women to an existing narrative from which they were previously missing, and thus recreate groups that were once defined in attempts to diminish them, it might be preferable to turn things around. During the exhibition History Unfolds at the Swedish History Museum, Historical Archaeological Museum in Stockholm, relearning as a method was connected to a discussion about uses of history in museums. And I underline this, uses of history, that is the constructive way a museum can walk. In an exhibition section titled A Reflection, a room in which the museum analyzed its earlier uses of history, there was, among other things, an image on display that showed the contents of a grave in which 2 grown men and a child had been buried together. This arrangement used to be interpreted by the museum and archaeologists as a grave of 3 brothers, until DNA testing proved that the individuals weren't genetically related at all. The former interpretation, concluding that 3 brothers were buried together, prompted us to consider how scholars and museums anachronistically project their own contemporary notions of families and other social relations onto the past. But instead of labeling the grave as a burial of two male lovers and their foster child, which would be an equally anachronistic but mirrored interpretation based on today's heterosexual family as standard, the exhibition reflected on the burial's use of history by asking questions about the interpretations of every other grave with more than one individual in it. I mean, if they find two people, one female skeleton and one male, it's of course an heterosexual couple from the, I don't know, prehistoric times. But what do we know? We can question every interpretation of every grave that has been done hitherto. But yeah, so I will just underscore this again. In cases where conclusions used to be drawn based on heteronormative courses of inquiry, we may instead ask whether people buried together in archaeological excavated graves, regardless of gender, are siblings, form some sort of covenant, were part of the same social family, or simply ended up interred together. And archaeologists, they say you might bury people in the same grave over time, over hundreds and thousands of years, and they are just sinking together, laying there, and becoming a family all of a sudden. Yeah, but there are. This is a way to go, but it's also, of course, problems with this model number 3. It has its downsides. It's difficult to consider yourself a contributor to injustice and discrimination. It's difficult to gauge your own position of privilege, and it's difficult to accept that you yourself, as a museum professional, are a part of a privileged group based on your gender, sexuality, social standing, skin tone, special skills, capabilities, and so on. It's difficult for us to regard ourselves as participants in oppressive showcasings and exhibitions. But even if those of us who are part of certain privileged groups haven't personally contributed to historically occurring injustices and marginalizations, we do have a duty to learn about how these affect the lives of others, in particular if our museum is funded by public means, tax fundings. According to Model 1, a museum that wants to participate in the efforts of mainstream society against marginalization shouldn't take just a critical approach to its earlier uses of history, but also strive to creatively challenge its own past and part in maintaining hierarchical divides between privileged and marginalized groups. However, it's difficult for us, if it's difficult for us as individuals to acknowledge privileging and marginalization, it's also hard for museums to become aware of the need for relearning. And an additional problem with the third model's focus on critical awareness is that it is based on the assumption that knowledge about earlier excluding narratives in museums means that you want to change if you realize this process or situation. Even if museums starts asking critical questions about how certain ideals have been written into and perpetuated throughout their operations, there's no guarantee that museum visitors are going to want to change anything about mainstream society that has been reflected in museums previously. They might see it as, well, this is the truth. This is how it has been and will be. It's just natural. Okay, let's move to the last model. The emphasis of Model 4 isn't on structures, but rather on discourses which casually repeat or cite ideals that privilege certain groups and marginalize others. These citations or repetitions aren't always intended or planned. They also occur unintentionally or without us even thinking about it. Language is intrinsic to Model 4. Language frames how we think, express emotions, act, and interact when we want to examine how discourses and stakeholders, such as museums, explain and narrate, describe and depict. According to this last model, harmful citations are considered to both legitimize and maintain marginalization and privileging. Such a practice of repetition might be to distribute ideas about the privileged and the marginalized, having separate, different characteristics. And some of the methods to achieve goals in Model 4 is, for instance, museums that works with uses of history as a method to create exhibition that change things. They could, for example, critically expose their own harmful You know, when you stand here, you get sometimes some kind of aphasia. Citational practices. One method is to critically expose museums' own harmful citational practices. The Swedish History Museum did this in an exhibition, in the exhibition History Unfolds. For example, when choosing to highlight and discuss how the museum's interpretation of and narratives about these two men buried with a child have changed over time. Employing DNA technology when analyzing archaeological data doesn't necessarily intend to criticize casual repetition. However, the result of research, DNA research, may have such consequences. For instance, in 2017, when archaeologists at Uppsala University and the Swedish Archaeological Museum, through DNA analysis, concluded that the supposedly male person that had been buried with a rich variety of weapons in what used to be referred to as the warrior grave at Birka turned out to be a woman. It wasn't a male laying in this grave, it was a woman, according to the DNA. The result received international attention, debate, and even wrath. Yet another example of the method to critically expose your own casual citations was demonstrated in an exhibition with a narrative about the oldest human remain found in present-day Sweden. The story focused on the hunter from Barum, a prehistoric person who was found buried with hunting and fishing gear in present-day Skåne in southern Sweden. It's 7,000 years old or something, this remain. For a long time, archaeologists described the person as male until osteologists discovered that the individual had given birth several times. By quoting or casually repeating contemporary ideas and ideals about hunters, gender, archaeologists interpreted prehistory anachronistically. Their interpretation of gender repeated previously established ideals about masculinity and femininity linked to genitalia. But nowadays, this prehistoric person is instead called the woman from Barum. But critically exposing one's own harmful citational practices doesn't really ever end. To refer to the find from Barum as a woman continues to portray this prehistoric hunter through a gendered lens, which encourage anachronistic associations. Our current binary divide of gender, exemplified by using women, wasn't in use during prehistoric times. It would be more relevant to refer to this prehistoric human as the Barum hunter, a hunter who also happened to give several births. This method of investigating uses of history and casual repetition in museums can be a starting point for conversations about which stereotypes are at play to restrict, legitimize, or naturalize certain ideals about gender or sexuality, and how these stereotypes anachronistically influence our perceptions about the past. Instead of adding the excluded or marginalized by producing exhibitions for them or about them, exhibitions that want to accomplish change, generate questions about how processes of marginalization were established and continuously are legitimized. This is not going to happen by exhibiting a couple of queer wax figures holding each other's hands or including them in a narrative about a certain era. It will happen by problematizing the great narratives, descriptions of gender and sexuality. But of course, it's a lot of problems with model number 4 as well. One problem with a method of exhibition that change museums and the visitor is that there is no shortcut. These methods may take some time, and it's not always easy to rethink. This model has the same difficulties with relearning processes model 3 has. Constantly having to question harmful citations and their supplementations. Supplementation might be considered both problematic and or enabling. I might not have said something about supplementation, right? But when you do one harmful practice, citational practice, you might also add something more to it. For instance, an example is that was described by ableist activist, disabled activist. I don't know how you say that today, actually. We say funktionsvarierad in Swedish. But anyway, Jonas Franksson has a slight CP damage or variation, and he sits in a wheelchair. And he described that when people are talking to him, they are övertydliga. They are really explaining everything very slowly, like they were talking to a child. And that's some kind of citational practices when you're talking to someone with a CP variation in a wheelchair. But it also demasculinizes him by being childish. And to be a child is masculinized. You know what I mean. It demasculinizes him. And so it's a supplement to this citational practice. Do you see what I mean? It's intersectional. Oppression is always intersectional. And we have to consider that as well. And the above example about the hunter from Barum illustrates that this is a constant process of questioning your uses of history and narration of it. Time and time again, critical questions must be posed to collectors, preservers, and curators. Another problem is that it is risky to challenge which has been taken for granted. When archaeologists, through this DNA test, noted that the so-called warrior grave at Birka, and that it was a female buried in it, it turned the story upside down and it caused a stir, a debate, and anger, and it was. In Le Monde, it was in New York Times, it was in The Guardian, it was all over in the world, discussing this and also putting the archaeologists, the researchers down, and they got hate mails. I was sitting beside one in the research room at the museum, and she received a lot of hate mails because of this. So it's risky to turn things upside down. You might consider that when you do it. So everybody in the museums must be with you. You must guide your professional colleagues through these things so that the communication office is alert when a research is released that will turn things upside down, or if you will present a controversial exhibition. You might have people standing outside with placards protesting. People must be aware that it can be a risky thing. So all those kind of reactions indicate that crisis may occur when that which we have taken for granted through harmful citations is questioned. So the method of problematizing and scrutinizing ideals and norms in museums has encountered some resistance by museum professionals and visitors and critical external voices. There have been some research done on these reactions as well. But strong reactions often stem from a strong commitment, and it's important for a museum to meet this commitment. It is thus crucial that the entire museum, all departments, take part in relearning processes. Thank you. So we have 3 minutes for questions, I think. Is that correct?
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask why you decided to use the term transsexuality, which is a couple of times, which is a highly debated term. So I wanted to ask what your idea behind that was. Thank you.
Yeah, I should have used transgender or trans. Yeah. Thank you for correcting me. I have had this. I have used the English translation many times and just didn't reflect on it. Good point. Everything is glasklart.
Since I know what you've been writing, I could also ask you to say something about how museums should cooperate with for example, researchers and so on, because you've been writing quite much about that as well. What do you think? How do you think that kind of cooperation, and also with the communities?
Yeah, I know it's there's a lot of cuts in for the funding of museums, and it's a lot of cuts for research at the universities. And unfortunately, even though you have all these magnificent projects running here, but one way of doing it is, of course, to invite researchers to do guided comments on shows, permanent exhibitions on the museums. That's a way of cooperating with researchers, to just invite them from the nearby university and have them comment the exposé. And another way is to have public discussions, these public dialogues that are where you can mix researchers, activists, artists, curators, professional museum professionals, and they can have like it's called fish bowls discussions, where they sit in the middle and discussing with themselves, and then you have the audience sitting in circles around, and you have a moderator that the audience can pose questions to, and who can bring it into the discussions every now and then. And of course, it's the usual thing to try to get fundings so that researchers can be within the museum working there. But many researchers that I know about and that I've been workshopping with in this project and in other projects has witnessed that they land there as a UFO, an unidentified flying object. And when they leave the museum, it's first a little burnt spot on the grass, and then eventually it's grown over with new grass, and no one remembered that they were there. So I think that all museums are struggling with integrating research in the museum. And it's about that you have a research unit perhaps, and then you have the guides, you have the pedagogues, you have the curators, the producers, you have the time leads, you talk different languages. I'm writing a lot about this, that we, as a researcher, you are used to use critical, the term, the concept critical. We are trained to be critical. It means something in an academic profession to be critical. It's not anything negative, but in the daily out there in the daily life, it's negative to be critical. So when I said, well, we have to think critically about this, why do you always have to be so negative? Can't we be positive? You know, so we have these language difficulties. So I think it's one way is also to be very open with where you come from as a researcher, where you come from as a creator, a pedagogue, a producer, and an artist. Be clear and open about your objectives, your time limits, your language, and be very humble towards each other, and try to listen in to where the other people in the theme who are building the new museum, the new exhibition, or whatever, where they belong to, and how their nomenclaturas, so to say, the way they are talking, their aims.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Pia, for your...
Kiitos paljon.
Kiitoksia. That was really interesting and inspiring. Thank you for being here with us. So this was for this morning. Thank you for all our speakers. Great that you got here and shared your thoughts and ideas with us. And thank you for all our audience online. We now end this session and we are going to continue after the lunch break with workshops. Thank you and bye-bye.